The broadcast that changed everything. The dim glow of countless stars stretched across the viewport of the United Earth Government's emergency chamber in Geneva. A heavy silence hung over the vast hall as 500 representatives from Earth and its colonies sat in rigid attention. Normally, this chamber was a place of negotiation, of cautious words and diplomatic restraint. But tonight, diplomacy was over. Tonight, humanity had reached its breaking point. At the center of the chamber, standing behind the polished steel podium, Ambassador Daniel Sloan felt the weight of billions pressing on his shoulders. His uniform, pristine as always, concealed the exhaustion of the sleepless night before. His sharp eyes swept across the gathered officials, then turned toward the towering holoprojector behind him. With a flick of his wrist, the display ignited to life. The grainy recording that had been broadcast across the galaxy only hours ago filled the screen. The Imperial News Network had shown it with pride. A message of absolute power. But to humanity, it was an act of war. 50,000 people stood in a wide execution yard, their faces pale under the artificial light. Doctors, engineers, merchants, aid workers, humans who had done nothing but try to help others. They knelt in long, organized rows, trembling as black-armored Imperial enforcers aimed plasma rifles at their backs. A single figure, clad in ceremonial robes, stood before them, reading their so-called sentence. These individuals have been found guilty of aiding known dissidents against the sovereignty of the Imperial Dominion. By decree of His Supreme Majesty, they are hereby sentenced to public termination for crimes against the stability of the galaxy. The camera zoomed in on some of the faces. Dr. Elise Carter, a woman who had pioneered medical treatments for alien species once deemed untreatable. Derek Voss, an engineer who had worked tirelessly to provide clean water to Outer Rim colonies. Sloan clenched his fists as he stared at their expressions. Resolute, defiant, unbroken. Then the executioners fired. The screen flickered as 50,000 lives were erased in an instant. Gasps filled the chamber, some quiet sobs barely suppressed. But there was no shock, only fury. Sloan took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch before he spoke. His voice was even, but beneath it burned a rage hotter than any sun. "These were our people," he said, his words calm but sharp as a blade. "Doctors, scientists, teachers, workers, men, women, and children." He tapped a button, and the screen changed to show a list. Names upon names scrolling endlessly, their identities now reduced to nothing more than a record of the dead. He turned his gaze toward the assembled representatives. The Empire did not execute criminals. They did not punish traitors. They killed men and women whose only crime was compassion. A murmur spread through the chamber like distant thunder, growing in intensity. Sloan continued, voice unwavering. "The Dominion has broken 47 clauses of the Galactic Charter of Rights, a charter they themselves signed. There was no trial, no due process. This was not justice. This was a message." He leaned forward, hands gripping the podium. "They wanted to show the galaxy that resistance is futile, that no one can stand against them, that humanity would kneel like so many others before us." The murmurs turned into outraged shouts, fists slamming against tables. Admiral Helena Trask of the United Earth Fleet stood from her seat, her gray uniform marked with the insignia of 2 decades of service. "They think their control of hyperspace routes makes them untouchable," she said, her voice cold as steel. "That we rely on their trading lines to survive. They believe we're weak." She turned to Sloan. "They're wrong." Sloan nodded. With another press of a button, the holo display changed. The Empire's known trade routes appeared, a vast network of interconnected highways spanning the stars. Then, a new set of lines in blue began to overlay them, expanding outward like an intricate web. "These," Sloan said, his voice hard with certainty, "are the routes they don't know about." The chamber fell into stunned silence. "For over a decade, we have been mapping and securing hidden paths through the void," Admiral Trask continued. routes outside the Empire's jurisdiction, trade lanes they have no power over. A low, approving rumble filled the chamber. Sloane pressed forward, his next words hammering through the hall like the beat of war drums. The Empire thinks their broadcast of mass murder will force the galaxy into submission. He let the words hang before continuing. They think we will issue a weak protest, negotiate for meaningless concessions, and then continue trading with them like nothing happened. He let a slow, deliberate smile cross his face. They have made the single greatest mistake in their history. A roar erupted from the chamber. The time for measured diplomacy is over, Sloane declared. The time for justice has come. He raised a clenched fist. We will not plead with tyrants. We will not bow to butchers. We will break them. The chamber erupted into unanimous agreement, hundreds of hands slamming onto tables, voices rising in defiant unity. The decision was made. Humanity would no longer play by the Empire's rules. They would make their own. The Empire thought they could silence dissent with a single message of fear. Now, humanity would send a message back. And this time, the entire galaxy would hear it. The Empire's worst nightmare begins. The Imperial High Council sat in their grand chamber, an imposing structure of obsidian and metal, built to project fear and dominance. Grand Chancellor Varric Rall, a man known for his ruthless efficiency, stood at the center of the circular chamber, surrounded by 12 of the most powerful individuals in the Dominion. Each one controlled vast fleets, planetary economies, and legions of soldiers across hundreds of star systems. And yet, at this moment, they sat in absolute silence, their usual arrogance replaced with barely concealed uncertainty. The broadcast of the executions had been meant to reaffirm imperial control, a warning to any who would dare challenge their rule. But something had gone terribly wrong. The human response had been immediate, calculated, and far more dangerous than they had predicted. Varric clenched his jaw as the report from Imperial intelligence scrolled before him, the words burning into his mind. Trade routes compromised. Human supply networks unknown. Economic instability projected within 6 standard months. This cannot be possible. High Minister Ogren Xel, a reptilian member of the council, hissed in disbelief. His clawed fingers tapped nervously against the polished black table. The humans do not have the infrastructure to challenge our trade dominance. Our intelligence reports have always. Your intelligence reports were wrong. Varric snapped, his tone like a whip. Our spies were too focused on their fleets, their weapons, their military. But the humans weren't preparing for a war of ships and lasers. He turned to the Imperial Trade Minister, a thin, pale-skinned bureaucrat who had once boasted of human dependency on the Empire's economy. How long until our industries feel the effects? The minister swallowed hard. His voice trembled as he spoke. 2 standard months at most. Murmurs of disbelief spread across the room. Varric's fingers curled into a fist. Explain. The minister adjusted his ornate collar, clearly uncomfortable. For years, human corporations have been expanding into deep space mining operations outside our jurisdiction. We assumed these were minor ventures, but he exhaled shakily. It appears they were deliberately creating an independent supply chain, one that completely bypasses our control. Varric's blood ran cold. For centuries, the Empire had maintained power not just through military might, but through economic strangulation. They controlled the flow of rare elements, hyperspace routes, and the distribution of vital resources. It allowed them to keep entire civilizations in check, to ensure that no empire, no republic, no species could rise against them. And yet, humanity had found a way out. A secret network, hidden in the void. An entire economic ecosystem, growing in the shadows. All of it beyond the Empire's grasp. The humans aren't fighting us, Varric muttered. They're replacing us. A heavy silence followed his words. Then, the chamber doors burst open. A uniformed officer rushed inside, his face pale with distress. "Grand Chancellor, the latest sector reports." He hesitated, eyes flicking toward the gathered council. "Speak," Varric commanded. The officer swallowed. "3 of our major industrial colonies have declared neutrality. They've cut off all shipments to Imperial core worlds." Gasps filled the chamber. Varric stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "Which colonies?" The officer hesitated, then spoke 3 names. Varric felt his stomach drop. Those were not minor colonies. Those were key production worlds, worlds that supplied starship parts, weapons, and military-grade alloys to the Imperial Navy. The Empire's war machine depended on them. And now, they were gone. "This is a declaration of war," one of the council members snarled. "If we do not act now, more will follow." The humans. Varric silenced him with a raised hand. His mind was racing. They wanted war. They wanted to send a fleet to crush the defiant worlds, to make an example of them. But he knew better. The humans had spent years preparing for this moment. If they had the foresight to create a hidden economic network, then they had certainly accounted for the Empire's military response. If he sent a fleet, it would likely never return. No, the humans were not fighting with brute force. They were fighting with precision. And they were winning. Varric exhaled sharply and turned to his fellow council members. "We cannot afford to act recklessly. This is not a battle of ships and armies." He tapped a control panel, bringing up a galactic map, showing a web of human-controlled trade routes intertwining with their own. "This is a battle of influence, control, and survival." He turned to the Imperial Intelligence Director. "We need leverage. Find me something. Anything. I want weaknesses in their new network. A fault, a vulnerability." The director hesitated. "Grand Chancellor, our operatives have been unable to infiltrate the human networks. Their encryption, their security protocols, they've outmaneuvered us at every turn." Varric's vision darkened. He had underestimated them. They had all underestimated them. And now, for the first time in centuries, the Empire was vulnerable. As the chamber descended into heated debate, Varric turned toward the viewport, staring into the vastness of space. He had always believed that fear was the greatest weapon, that no species would ever dare rise against the Empire, no matter how oppressed they were. But humanity had not only rejected fear, they had weaponized defiance. And now, the entire galaxy was watching. If the Empire did not act soon, their enemies, long silent, long afraid, would rise as well. And then, the Empire would burn, the spark that ignites the fire. The United Earth Government war room was silent, but the air crackled with energy. A massive circular table dominated the space, its sleek black surface covered in holographic projections of enemy movements, trade disruptions, and secret supply lines. Around it stood the greatest minds of humanity, military leaders, intelligence officers, and economic strategists. At the center, Ambassador Daniel Sloan watched as Admiral Helena Trask manipulated the floating data streams with swift, calculated motions. "The Empire is preparing to retaliate," Trask said, her voice sharp and unwavering. "But they don't know where to strike." Sloan leaned in, his fingers pressing against the cool metal surface. They expected a war of ships and fleets. They wanted a straightforward rebellion they could crush quickly. Instead, we gave them a war of shadows and consequences. A chuckle came from across the table. Director Adrian Wells of Earth Intelligence, a man with eyes sharp as a predator's, tapped a holographic window displaying a flurry of intercepted Imperial transmissions. "They're panicking," he said, voice laced with amusement. "Trade ministers are screaming at the Grand Chancellor. Governors are demanding emergency resources. Their fleets are strong, but their supply chains are rotting from the inside." Trask smirked. "So much for their unbreakable dominion." A small, knowing smile tugged at Sloane's lips, but he pushed it down. They couldn't afford overconfidence. Not yet. "We need to push them further," he said. make them second-guess every decision. We've cut off their raw materials. Now we hit their logistics." He turned to Commander Elias Novak, the head of the Outer Rim Resistance, a coalition of independent traders, ex-imperial defectors, and rogue operatives. "Elias," Sloan said, his tone heavy with meaning, "it's time for Operation Blackout." A hush fell over the room. Novak cracked a grin, brushing a hand through his short-cropped hair. "I was wondering when you'd say that." With a flick of his wrist, the display shifted to show deep space relay stations, each one marked with the Imperial sigil. The Empire relies on these communication relays to coordinate fleet movements, planetary orders, and economic transactions. They don't use a single network. They have hundreds of isolated nodes, making a direct cyber attack impossible. Novak's grin widened. "But we don't need to attack them all. Just a few key ones." The holo display zoomed in on 3 specific stations, one near the Merkai Nebula, another in the Perseus Rift, and a third orbiting a distant Imperial fortress world. "If we knock out these 3, Novak explained, "we don't just disrupt their supply lines. We blind them. They won't be able to track fleet deployments in half their sectors. They'll be scrambling to re-establish control, and in the chaos, we strike where it hurts." Trask nodded approvingly. "You want to make them start fighting themselves." Novak snapped his fingers. "Exactly. Misinformation, rerouted supplies, accidental friendly fire." His grin was wicked. "We let their own arrogance do the work for us." Sloan exhaled. This was a dangerous move, but if it worked, it would cripple the Empire's strategic response before it could even begin. He turned to Wells. "How soon can we deploy?" Wells didn't hesitate. 2 hours. Sloan nodded. "Then let's make history." The first strike. 3 stealth cruisers, each equipped with experimental cloaking technology, slipped through the vastness of space, invisible against the endless void. Aboard the lead ship, Callisto's Ghost, Commander Novak stood beside Lieutenant Mara Voss, their top infiltration specialist. "The first relay is just ahead," Voss said, peering at the faint glow of the Merkai relay station in the distance. "Automated defenses are minimal. Should be an easy in and out." Novak smirked. "I'll believe that when I see it." The crew moved silently, each step calculated, each breath measured. The Callisto's Ghost maneuvered into position, slipping past Imperial patrols with surgical precision. Then, with a single coded transmission, Novak sent the order. "Begin the blackout." Voss and her team launched from the airlock, their zero-gravity suits carrying them across the void like silent phantoms. They reached the station, hacking through its outer defenses in seconds. Inside, Imperial technicians barely had time to register the alarms before they were knocked unconscious. Voss plugged a device into the primary control terminal, and the screens flickered violently before going dark. "The relay is ours," she whispered into her comm. Novak grinned. 1 down. Within minutes, the same sequence played out across the other 2 targets. And just like that, the Empire went blind. The aftermath. Chaos in the Dominion. The Imperial High Command was in disarray. Reports flooded in from every sector. Supply convoys disappearing. Fleet orders lost. Entire systems going silent. Grand Chancellor Varric Raul stood in the Imperial War Room, his expression dark as he scanned the erratic fleet movements on the central display. "Our patrols are losing coordination," Admiral Kiro barked, slamming his gauntleted fist on the table. "We've already lost contact with the Eldari front, and now 3 entire sectors are in radio silence." "They aren't in silence," Varric growled. "They've been cut off." The realization settled over the war room like a storm cloud. The humans had struck first, and they had struck where it mattered most. Varric turned to his intelligence officer. "I want countermeasures now." But the officer hesitated, his face pale. "Sir, we don't have countermeasures." Silence. Varric felt his pulse quicken. "Explain." The officer swallowed hard. "The humans aren't attacking us the way we expected. This isn't sabotage, it's precision dismantling. They know our weaknesses better than we know their strengths. Varric's hands tightened into fists. This was supposed to be a simple suppression, a demonstration of imperial dominance. Instead, the empire was crumbling from the inside. Varric's gaze drifted toward the towering display of imperial-controlled space, once glowing with undeniable power. Now it was splintering, fractures forming where there had once been unyielding control. The humans weren't just fighting back. They were winning. And for the first time in 300 years, the Empire knew fear.